Welcome to this week's health commentary. I'm Mike McGee. Title this week is If We Were Angels, and you'll see the reason why in a few minutes. But as we're entering this potentially historic week with a former president doing his best to reignite a civil war in our nation, we do well to take a breath and reread James Madison's words from Federalist number 51. Part of that is, if men were angels, but we'll get to that in a moment. First, a few words of history. When it came to checks and balances in this new national experiment in self-governance, the founders, while establishing three co-equal branches, left one of those branches the task of defining by practice its power and its influence. The new Constitution in 1787 awarded one branch, the elected Congress, the daunting power to impeach, convict, and remove representatives or appointed federal officials for due cause, up to the president himself. But at the same time, it also empowered a second branch, the executive, through its president, veto power to check legislative excesses, and the privilege of initiating appointments to the federal judiciary. It was only the third branch of the government, the judiciary, that was left deliberately elastic by the founders, destined to grow into the triangle of power. 13 years later, on February 17, 1801, Congress was forced to break a tie in the Electoral College vote, resolving a constitutional crisis and declaring the victor in one of the most acrimonious presidential campaigns in U.S. history. Thomas Jefferson was awarded the victory, and John Adams acquiesced and was sent packing a month later. But 2 days before he departed, Adams unloaded multiple appointments of circuit justices and justices of the peace, which the U.S. Senate quickly confirmed on March 3rd. In the rush, however, Adams' Secretary of State, John Marshall, who would soon become Chief Justice Marshall in the Supreme Court under the new President Jefferson, he didn't have time to complete that final necessary step for some of the applicants, delivering the commission, and so those few applicants were left without the reward of their judgeship. Now, when Jefferson took office the next day on March 4th, he saw the opportunity to block some judgeships due to this technicality. He instructed his new Secretary of State, James Madison, to not deliver the commissions. One of those prospective new judges, a Maryland businessman whose name was William Marbury, after trying to unlock his commission for several months, finally filed a lawsuit in December of 1801, demanding that his commission be delivered through a writ of mandamus, which is an order from a court to an inferior government official, ordering the government official to properly fulfill his duties. Eventually, the case came all the way to the Supreme Court, and John Marshall, then justice, delivered a unanimous verdict on February 24th, 1803, in the famous Marbury versus Madison decision. In short, William Marbury did not get his judgeship, not because he didn't deserve it, he did, and the decision said as much. But the court also recognized that the authority that Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 had granted the court to issue writs of mandamus was unconstitutional. This was because Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which had been signed a year or two earlier, made clear that the Supreme Court had the original jurisdiction over cases only where a U.S. state is party to the lawsuit. As legal experts have explained, while the decision limited federal court's decision, it cemented the court's status as the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution. Turns out William Marbury's loss became the nation's gain. Our third branch of government, in finding its voice, defined its own powers. As Justice Marshall wrote, quotes, "It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. A law repugnant to the Constitution is void." And as law historian Lawrence Freedman wrote, Here, for the first time, John Marshall in the U.S. Supreme Court dared to declare an act of Congress to be unconstitutional. Donald Trump, for a time, sat himself in the middle of America's triangle of power. From his seat as president, he installed himself as a golden idol and had a commanding view of the executive branch of government. By aligning with the Federalist Society, the Christian right, and Mitch McConnell, he also was able to stack the judiciary and deliver a promised reversal of Roe v. Wade. But that federal overreach, which included rejecting 50 years of precedent and compromising women's freedom and autonomy over their own bodies, fueled a resounding 2020 Trump defeat and Republican statewide underperformance 2 years later in the 2022 midterm elections. It also triggered a first ever president-led armed insurrection on January 6, 2021. But in a real-life democracy stress test, this may be the week when our three branches of government finally decide to deliver a message to all Americans that no man is above the law. First, our citizenry pried the executive branch free of Trump in 2020. Second, our judiciary, including state and federal courts, have rejected nearly 100 bogus cases led by unethical lawyers on Trump's behalf and are nearing multiple indictments of a now unprotected and disgraced former president. And third, a Republican-led Congress has been forced to privately cooperate on real issues while publicly feigning continued fealty to Trump and a small brand of Trump lookalikes intent on driving their party over the cliff. So let's get back to James Madison. What did he write as the author of Federalist number 51? And what do we have to say about it now? Well, on February 8th, 1788, he wrote this: "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In forming a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." Now, Trump for us is the stress test, and our nation has risen to the challenge. We're gradually, slowly, even painfully learning to control ourselves by enforcing our laws. Democracy is, after all, a work in progress.